Inside a Smithsonian storage drawer sits a stone barely bigger than a phone that helped bury one of America's most racist myths, then spent the next century quietly smuggling a second lie-in right behind it. The stone was supposed to prove Cherokee ancestors built America's great mounds. Instead, it proved the same federal agency debunking one myth had planted a forgery inside its own landmark report and let it stand, uncorrected, for over 100 years. It started with one struggling field assistant, John Emmert, buried in debt and afraid of losing his government paycheck, who handed his supervisor exactly the discovery he needed. In February 1889, working alone in a burial mound at Bat Creek, Tennessee, Emmert pulled that stone from beneath 9 skeletons, and by the time anyone thought to check his work, it was already too late to undo the damage. That gap, a small plain slab once treated as some of the most important physical evidence in North American archaeology, is the whole story in miniature. No gold, no gemstones, nothing that would draw a second glance in a gift shop case, and yet for well over a century, it carried the weight of a federal government's official position on who built ancient America. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to a lie the country told itself for the better part of a century. Across the 1800s, settlers pushing into Ohio, Tennessee, and the Mississippi Valley kept finding earthworks they couldn't explain, massive geometric enclosures 1,000 feet across, serpent-shaped mounds winding through forest clearings, burial sites packed with copper ornaments, pearl beads, and carved stone pipes, places like Cahokia, the Newark earthworks, the Great Serpent Mound. The popular explanation was not that native nations had built any of it. Newspapers, popular books, and even members of Congress floated a vanished race of mound-building giants or refugees from Atlantis, or one of the lost tribes of Israel, a people who supposedly raised these structures first, before the native peoples living nearby simply moved in afterward, incapable of that level of engineering themselves. It sounds absurd now. At the time, it did real damage. If indigenous nations hadn't built the mounds, the argument went, they had a weaker claim to the land the mound stood on, a convenient piece of pseudo-history for a government actively taking that land anyway. The myth even had a bestseller behind it. Josiah Priest's 1833 book, American Antiquities, credited the mounds to Egyptians, Phoenicians, or Israelites, sold tens of thousands of copies, and made it into school books within a decade, while Georgia was auctioning off Cherokee land to speculators on the same calendar. In 1881, the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology assigned Cyrus Thomas, a former minister and self-taught naturalist, to settle the question with actual field data. Thomas spent over a decade sending teams into hundreds of mound sites, and his 1894 report, Mound Explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology, did exactly what it set out to do, tying mound building techniques and continuity of use directly to living indigenous nations, including the ancestors of the Cherokee and Shawnee. It remains one of the most consequential debunkings in the history of American archaeology. Part of what made that report credible was Thomas's willingness to throw out evidence that didn't hold up. Decades earlier, in 1838, another inscribed stone had surfaced during excavation of the Grave Creek Mound in present-day West Virginia. Its symbols claimed by promoters as Phoenician or Hebrew proof of the same vanished race Josiah Priest had been selling. Thomas examined it and rejected it, along with other unprovenanced relics, calling out fabricated inscriptions by name. Thomas even went further, noting in his report that fabricated inscriptions may be found scattered all over the country, planted by people looking to make a name for themselves. That's the reputation he built, the careful scientist who separated real data from planted fantasy, and who knew exactly how these hoaxes tended to get made, which makes what happened next so hard to explain away. Because sitting inside that same landmark report, one exhibit among hundreds, was a single object that would spend the next 130 years quietly working against everything the report was trying to prove. In February 1889, John Emmert opened a burial mound near Bat Creek, Tennessee, and beneath 9 skeletons, reported finding a small engraved stone, a set of bracelets, and a wood and metal ornament. The stone carried a short line of angular characters. Thomas examined them and wrote that they were beyond question letters of the Cherokee alphabet. In a report built to prove indigenous authorship using physical evidence, this was close to the perfect artifact. Not pottery, not a tool, but writing. The mound builder's own hand describing themselves. Thomas had already gone further in print. 4 years earlier, in a pamphlet titled The Cherokee in Pre-Columbian Times, he'd used this same stone to argue Cherokee ancestors had writing centuries before Sequoyah invented his syllabary in 1821, a bold claim that needed exactly this kind of artifact to survive scrutiny. Now look closer at how that proof actually reached the world, and the story stops feeling tidy. Emmert was working essentially alone. No second archaeologist verified the find as it came out of the ground. No photograph shows the stone in place before it was lifted. His notes are vague about its exact position and the layer it came from, vague in a way that makes a modern excavator's stomach drop. Emmert's own life was unstable at the time. Correspondence describes financial strain and a documented struggle with drinking, and he needed that federal paycheck. Other objects he supplied over the years have drawn their own quiet skepticism. And the bracelets found beside the stone were later dated stylistically to the 18th or 19th century. Not antiquity, not even close. Genuinely ancient burial goods don't share a grave with post-contact jewelry unless something about that burial had been disturbed or staged. None of that proves fraud by itself. But it plants a question that never fully goes away. What does a struggling field assistant working alone in the field produce when he understands exactly what kind of discovery his supervisor is desperate to find at the exact moment a decade-long federal investigation needs a clean, dramatic answer? A find like this should have been documented in place, measured against the surrounding soil, and photographed before anything was lifted from the ground. Emmert's report skips almost all of it. Making things worse, the Bureau's original field records for the entire survey were largely discarded around 1920, decades before anyone thought to question the find. The stone sat almost undisturbed for the better part of a century after that. Then, in the 1970s, somebody looked at it again and did not see Cherokee letters at all. Cyrus Gordon, a respected scholar of Semitic languages, argued Thomas had it upside down. Flip the stone, Gordon said, and the marks resolve into Paleo-Hebrew, reading roughly, holy to Yahweh. Not 19th century Cherokee, ancient, old world, the kind of writing that would force a rewrite of who first reached North America. Gordon wasn't a fringe amateur. He had genuine academic standing. And in 1988, the theory picked up scientific backup. A small fragment of wood from the ornament found near the stone was sent for radiocarbon analysis, a method that measures the decay of a radioactive form of carbon absorbed by living material, letting scientists estimate roughly how long ago an organic object stopped being alive. The result placed that wood fragment somewhere between 32 AD and 769 AD, squarely ancient, nowhere near the 1800s. Researchers including Joseph Mahan and J. Houston McCulloch picked up the case publicly, arguing Bat Creek was physical proof of a pre-Columbian Old World voyage into the American Southeast, centuries before Columbus, and possibly before the Vikings ever touched North American soil. Here's why that date wasn't the slam dunk it looked like. The sample was small, taken from decayed wood, processed without the isotope correction later labs would consider standard. And critically, it dated wood recovered near the stone, not the engraving itself. Old wood in a disturbed layer tells you something nearby might be ancient. It tells you nothing about the object lying next to it. Still, for a while, a federally excavated artifact, backed by a landmark government report, wrapped around a genuinely strange radiocarbon result, looked like it might bend the accepted timeline of American history. Then two archaeologists did something almost embarrassingly simple. They went looking for the exact phrase. Robert Mainfort Jr. and Mary Quace spent years quietly reinvestigating the Bat Creek case, comparing the engraved characters letter by letter against known Paleo-Hebrew sources and against 19th century Masonic reference material circulating in Emmert's era. And in 2004, they published their findings in the peer-reviewed journal American Antiquity. The inscription was not ancient at all. It was a close, letter-for-letter match to an illustration inside Robert McCoy's 1870 book, General History, Cyclopedia, and Dictionary of Freemasonry, a Masonic reference guide containing a Hebrew ceremonial phrase, printed 19 years before Emmert ever dug into that mound. The alignment wasn't approximate. Specific letterform quirks that would be nearly impossible to reproduce twice by coincidence across two supposedly unrelated, thousands of years apart sources showed up on the stone almost stroke for stroke. That is precisely where the proof falls apart, not because a lab produced a contradicting number, but because two researchers found the exact printed page it had been copied from. Skepticism from actual Semitic script specialists had existed for decades already. Harvard's Frank Moore Cross and Johns Hopkins' P. Kyle McCarter Jr. had rejected Gordon's reading on linguistic grounds, and McCarter placed the whole saga inside what he called the melodrama of American archaeology in the 19th century, a pointed way of saying this wasn't the first invented inscription dressed up as ancient proof and wouldn't be the last. Here's the detail that makes it stranger. Cyrus Thomas himself never mentioned the Bat Creek Stone again, not in his 1898, 1903, or 1905 books on North American archaeology. For a man who once called its markings beyond question and built part of a pamphlet around them, that silence is deafening. Researchers examining his later notes now believe Thomas quietly came to suspect the stone was a fraud, the same conclusion he had reached about Grave Creek decades earlier. He never said so publicly. He just stopped citing it, letting his own agency's claim sit uncorrected for the next 70 years until Gordon pulled it back out in 1970 and gave it an entirely new, equally false life. By 2014, the Smithsonian's own Department of Anthropology stopped hedging. Its curators, the museum said, believe the inscription is a forgery and the artifact is fake, and it remains in the collection specifically as part of the documented history of archaeological frauds. A federal institution now preserves this object, not as proof of Cherokee mound construction, and not as proof of ancient contact, but as a case study in how easily a fabricated artifact can slip into an official record and stay there for a century before anyone forces it out. It is worth remembering that nobody inside the Bureau or the Smithsonian ever publicly corrected the record on their own. It took outside researchers, decades later, to do it for them. Here is where most documentaries would call it solved. This one doesn't, because that ending isn't the ending. It's the halfway point. The forged stone being fake doesn't undo the truth it was recruited to defend. The Cherokee, the Shawnee, and other southeastern nations really did build mounds. That conclusion never rested on Bat Creek. It rests on decades of independent evidence Thomas's broader survey gathered elsewhere. Exposing one planted fake doesn't resurrect the vanished race myth. What it exposes is something quieter. How thin the line has always been between verified history and a story someone badly wanted to be true. That fragility didn't stay in the 19th century. It followed the word Cherokee straight into the present, into a fight that has nothing to do with mounds or inscriptions at all, a fight over who gets to claim the name. Here's a number that should stop you cold. In the 2020 census, roughly 1.5 million Americans self-identified as having Cherokee ancestry. Combined enrolled citizenship across all three federally recognized Cherokee tribes sits at roughly 450,000. The Cherokee Nation alone reported 466,181 citizens in 2024. Scholar Daniel Heath Justice, an enrolled Cherokee Nation citizen, published research in 2025 describing well over 1 million unaffiliated, unsubstantiated American claimants. People genuinely convinced of a Cherokee bloodline that none of the 3 actual tribal nations has any record of. Where does a gap that enormous come from? Part of that gap comes from one strangely consistent family legend, a great-great-grandmother who was supposedly a Cherokee princess, clustering overwhelmingly around one tribe out of hundreds, in a pattern that looks less like memory and more like a shared myth people reached for to explain ancestry they couldn't otherwise name. A similar pattern shows up among Appalachian communities historically called Melungeon, who developed competing origin legends over generations in a region with strict racial categorization laws. Portuguese sailors, shipwrecked Turks, lost members of the Roanoke colony, and again Cherokee ancestry. A 2012 genetic study led by researcher Roberta Estes examined Melungeon Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA and found ancestry patterns most consistent with African and European mixture, not the more romantic stories that had circulated for generations. It's the same mechanism at work in a different community, a comforting story standing in for a harder, messier truth. Then consumer DNA testing gave the myth a newer costume. Companies like 23andMe can flag genetic markers broadly associated with indigenous ancestry across the Americas. But as Native Studies scholar Kim Tallbear has spent years pointing out in public and academic settings, they can't tell you which of the hundreds of distinct sovereign Native nations that ancestry connects to, and they certainly can't grant citizenship in any of them. Tribal enrollment isn't a percentage on a screen. It's a legal relationship built on documented lineage and each nation's own law. When a prominent political figure released a DNA test in 2018, partly to address ancestry claims, a Cherokee Nation official called it useless and inappropriate. Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr. made the same point that year. A DNA test does not and cannot determine tribal citizenship. So if a forged inscription can't tell us who built the mounds, and a DNA test can't tell us who counts as Cherokee today, who actually gets to decide? That question runs straight back through this whole history, and it gets uglier before it gets any clearer. Start with Sequoyah, who in the early 1800s engineered a complete working syllabary for the Cherokee language from scratch, without being literate in any other script himself. Adopted formally in 1821, it worked so well that Cherokee literacy reportedly outpaced many surrounding settler communities within just a few years, one of the only documented cases in world history of a single person single-handedly designing a complete functional writing system for an entire language. There's a genuine scholarly debate over whether some character shapes were visually influenced by Latin letters he'd seen but couldn't read. A question about form, not a challenge to the invention itself. The syllabary became a tool of governance, printed in the Cherokee Phoenix, used to draft law and argue this was a self-governing people needing no outside permission, which makes what happened next harder to sit with. By 1835, the U.S. government wanted the Cherokee Nation's remaining Georgia land. Principal Chief John Ross, representing the clear majority, refused to sign it away. So federal negotiators located a small, self-appointed faction, a so-called treaty party with no legal authority to speak for the Cherokee Nation as a whole, and signed the Treaty of New Echota with them instead. Fewer than 100 people put their names on a document surrendering the entire Cherokee homeland east of the Mississippi. Ross countered with a petition from roughly 16,000 Cherokee citizens rejecting it. Congress ratified the treaty anyway, by a single Senate vote. 3 years later, federal troops rounded up an estimated 16,000 Cherokee people and forced them west on what became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died along the route, from exposure, disease, and starvation, in a removal most historians now treat as one of the darkest chapters of 19th century federal Indian policy. The National Park Service still researches the route today, and archaeological work continues at sites connected to the removal, including locations tied to mass graves. A tiny, unauthorized handful of people decided who legally spoke for an entire nation, and the consequences reached forward into a conflict most people assume ended long ago. It didn't. During the Civil War, The Cherokee Nation was divided, and some Cherokee citizens held enslaved black people, a fact the tribal government doesn't hide. After the war, an 1866 Reconstruction-era treaty required the Cherokee Nation to grant full citizenship rights to formerly enslaved people within the nation and their descendants, a group that came to be known as Cherokee freedmen. That citizenship held for well over a century, until 2007, when the Cherokee Nation voted to require documented blood for citizenship, stripping freedmen descendants of status they'd legally held since Reconstruction. Marilyn Vann, a freedman descendant, spent close to 20 years fighting that decision through tribal courts that repeatedly ruled against her, and ultimately through the federal court system. In August 2017, federal judge Thomas F. Hogan ruled in Cherokee Nation versus Nash that freedmen descendants have a present right to citizenship, coextensive with citizens who trace ancestry by blood. The Cherokee Nation accepted the ruling and in 2021 formally struck by blood language from its constitution. It took a federal court order and one plaintiff who refused to give up for 2 decades to force the answer. Layer these episodes together, and a pattern surfaces that a small forged stone accidentally previewed 130 years early. A struggling field assistant looking for a career-saving find. A minority faction claiming authority it didn't have. A tribal government under internal political pressure. A DNA company selling a percentage on a screen. Again and again, someone holding institutional power has tried to settle a question about Cherokee identity from the outside, using an object, a signature, or a spit sample as a shortcut around the harder, slower work of listening to the actual nation. And again, that shortcut has eventually failed. Sometimes it took decades to unravel. Sometimes it took a federal court order. The tension hasn't fully resolved. Sacred site disputes still surface around Keetoowah, the mother town near Bryson City, North Carolina, a foundational origin site where surveys have documented burials, with researchers estimating the broader site may hold well over 1,000 graves, most still undisturbed. In 2010, a proposed Duke Energy substation nearby drew formal objections from Cherokee tribal governments concerned about disturbing ground carrying that kind of historical and spiritual weight. It's the same underlying argument as the federal mound survey a century earlier and the citizenship case a decade ago. Who actually decides what happens to Cherokee land, Cherokee remains, and Cherokee history? The institutions holding the permits and paperwork, or the people the land and paperwork are actually about? Even the fringe theories that grew up in Bat Creek's shadow, decades after the forgery itself was already established, haven't fully gone quiet. Researcher Richard Thornton claimed to have found a lost Maya city at Track Rock Gap, Georgia, a dramatic pre-Columbian contact story that spread fast online. Professional archaeologists writing in the journal Early Georgia and the Georgia Council of Professional Archaeologists rejected it outright, as did all 3 federally recognized Cherokee tribes. The actual site is a documented Native American stone terrace and petroglyph complex with no connection to Mesoamerica at all. It's Bat Creek's pattern almost exactly repeated, a sensational, outside-imposed explanation competing against a quieter, better-supported indigenous one, and winning the headlines anyway, at least for a while. A forged Hebrew inscription and a lost Maya city generate books and traffic in a way that trained archaeologists confirmed what the local nation already knew never will. And that imbalance is part of why a story like Bat Creek can survive for a century before anyone catches up to it. So go back to that drawer. The Bat Creek stone still sits in Smithsonian storage today, occasionally loaned out for display at institutions, including the Museum of the Cherokee Indian, no longer labeled as proof of anything ancient, kept now, in the museum's own words, as part of the documented history of archaeological fraud. A small, deliberately engraved lie, preserved because remembering exactly how a lie like that gets made, and how long it can survive once it's stitched into an official government report, turns out to matter more than the object itself ever did. Above ground, The real answer to who the Cherokee are was never going to come from a stone in a drawer. It comes from Cherokee Nation, Eastern Band, and United Kituwa Band citizens, casting ballots in elections their ancestors fought to control. It comes from freedmen descendants who spent 20 years in courtrooms and won. It comes from a written language one silversmith built from nothing 2 centuries ago, still printed today, still functioning exactly the way he engineered it. A tool a sovereign nation controls entirely for itself. The forged stone tried to answer the question of Cherokee identity from the outside. Its inscription lifted almost stroke for stroke from a book its discoverer likely owned. It took over a century, but it failed. The census numbers, the DNA companies, the family legends about an untraceable great-great-grandmother are trying to answer that same question from the outside too, just with percentages and inherited stories instead of engraved stone. The nations keep giving the same answer they gave a federal court in 2017, and the same answer buried quietly in their own history long before that. Identity here was never something you could find buried in a mound, dissolved out of a cheek swab, or copied from somebody else's book. It is decided deliberately and continuously by the people who already belong to the nation, and by absolutely no one else. Somewhere in a climate-controlled drawer in Washington, under the same acid-free tray liner, next to bracelets that were never as old as anyone claimed, that small forged stone is still sitting in the dark. Still cataloged under the same number it's carried for over 130 years. Still cool to the touch if a gloved hand ever lifts it out again. And still quietly, proving the exact opposite of everything it was carved to prove.